welcome to the Daily Path podcast for February 3rd, 2025. Wow, almost got that wrong. We are in Matthew chapter 11 today. We're beginning kind of a new series, a new way of looking at Jesus' ministry for this week. We're going to look at how Jesus challenges us. We talked about this a little bit on Sunday as we were getting into Jesus draws a crowd and what does he do with the crowd. Oftentimes he's healing them, but also sometimes he's teaching them really challenging things that are hard to follow, things that might be hard for them to believe, things that ask them to change their hearts and lives. Today, in Matthew 11, we see that Jesus is confronting a couple cities. He says that these cities have seen his greatest works. They've seen his healings. They've heard his teachings. They know all about him, but they haven't changed their hearts and lives. All the evidence they've seen, all the proof that they've seen was not enough. It didn't change them. And so as we're thinking about challenging today, there's kind of two perspectives that I want to take on this. What does it feel like for Jesus to call us out, or for someone to call us out when we have not changed or lived the way that we said we want to, or the way that God asks us to? What does that feel like? Ideally, or one way we can talk about it is accountability. Accountability, it can be challenging. It can be hard to hold someone else accountable. It can feel hard to be held accountable. But we really get in trouble when we don't hold people accountable appropriately, when we don't allow other people to hold us accountable appropriately. Entropy is one of these theories in science, and everything is devolving towards chaos. Accountability is the challenge that allows us to keep fighting against entropy and keep trying to build back in complexity, take away the laziness or the apathy or the cynicism, and keep focused on the mission, on the task, on loving and sharing. There's all kinds of ways that of things that can enter into a system that bring more chaos, more entropy, and help it fall apart. In our spiritual lives, it might be that apathy, like, oh gosh, I've been going to church for a long time, and I've been sitting there listening to a pastor talk for a long time. I've been singing, it is well with my soul, or how great they are, time after time. And man, it just doesn't, what are we really doing here? Or it might be, I've followed God, and I've been praying and praying and praying, and I've just never gotten the answers to the prayers that I'm looking for. Is it just time to quit and to give up? Or entropy can come in and we're so busy that we don't have time. The church or our faith life, our own well-being is something that can be easy to put aside. I'm tired today, so I'm not going to do that. I'll skip that today. And over time, these things could add up. I think of compound interest in the high school, in economics class and math class. They teach you, start saving when you're young, because compound interest is a really powerful force. Well, in our lives, compound interest happens not just to our investments, but also to our relationships, also to our walks of faith. What are we investing in today that's going to pay a dividend tomorrow? What relationship are we building today that we don't have a purpose for, but is also going to be that person who's going to be there in our hardship? And so in this challenge that we hear, Jesus faces these two cities and says, man, you guys have seen amazing miracles. And if they had seen them in some of the worst places that Jesus can think of, or at least that his listeners can think of, they would have changed their hearts and their minds. And so one of the things that drives us into kind of decay or entropy is when we see and we no longer hear. We hear, we no longer pay attention. We no longer apply the things in our lives that are going to make a difference. And so here Jesus is challenging these cities. And as I read this, I don't get this chance that he's asking them for to turn around their hearts and lives anymore. It feels like something that's set in stone, that's a done deal. And maybe it is from their perspective, but I also know that in other places, Jesus keeps these doors of grace open. It's never too late to change your heart and your mind. And so what evidence actually gets us to change our hearts and our minds. I think doctors, therapists, teachers, all kinds of people wish they had the secret to this. If anything, the people who have the biggest lock on this are marketers, the ones convincing us to buy things because we think they will change our hearts and our lives. But you could imagine a doctor wanting, okay, if I could just get my patient or my patients to do this, then if they could change their life in this way, it would have a huge domino effect on their health. Or if their teachers, could just get, if the kids could just sit still and listen, or if they could just grasp this concept, it's going to pay dividends for their tests or for their next class or for their lives at large. And you see it in churches too. If you could just grasp the depths of God's love for you, how much change and how much difference would that really and truly make? And so Jesus here, he's not afraid to challenge. He's not afraid to challenge these cities. He's not afraid to call them out. He's doing so publicly. That might not be the way that we always choose to hold people accountable. I know some people say praise in public and hold accountable in private. And sometimes you have to follow those rules. Sometimes you got to play around with those rules. Here Jesus is confronting people, and I kind of love this. It's religion and our faith lives can feel like often we're trying to hold God accountable. God, why don't you do this for me? Why didn't you make things come out this way? And those are good questions to ask, but also we can't forget that God is holding us accountable too, that God has a will for our lives, that God has boundaries for our lives, that God has this narrow path for us to be on. And Jesus is going to ask us, why aren't you on this path from time to time? And so the self-reflection becomes really important because Jesus often isn't here sitting next to us in a chair somewhere. Jesus isn't listening to this podcast with us, and we can't say, well, can you believe what Nick said today? It doesn't make any sense to me. Or, oh, man, maybe he's right. What do you want to hold me accountable to, Jesus? We don't hear his voice all the time. So the self-reflection becomes an ability for us to look at Scripture, look at our prayer lives, look at the examples that we're trying to follow. How can we follow this and put it into action, put it into practice? And Jesus confronts and challenges a lot of people. We're going to get to that over the course of this week. But he also, at the end of this chapter, he issues this invitation. And I think this invitation the people who are hearing this invitation, or the people that this invitation is extended to, has to overlap at least somewhat with this kind of condemnation and this challenge that he's got for these two cities that have seen his miracles. The invitation is still, come to me, all you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest. Put on my yoke and learn from me. I'm gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. My yoke is easy to bear, and my burden is light. Now, those words don't always feel true, but as we're going through hardship, I think often the burden of following Christ is easier than the burden of not following Christ, or the burdens that we find when we're not following Christ. But these words at the end are a challenge in a different way. It's kind of, do you trust me enough to unload your burdens on me? Do you trust me enough to say, yes, go where I send you, and trust me that I'm going to get you through that? There's this warmth and this welcome that's taking place at the end of this chapter. That challenge, like, okay, to get these things, you have to trust me. To experience this, you have to receive this invitation and respond to it. And so the challenge is that trusting and that believing, that handing over. And so today we've seen two unique ways that Jesus challenges us. One is holding us accountable when we've seen what God does, when we've seen what God has done, and we turn and don't change our hearts and lives anyway. When over time, maybe we've forgotten the things that God has already done in our lives. And the second one is to come and lay down your burdens and trust that you're going to be okay without carrying them yourself, that you can trust God to carry them, that God will be a good steward of our burdens on our behalf. And so I hope you enjoyed reading Matthew chapter 11 today. Let's close in prayer. God, we thank you so much that that this path of following you is not just a life of leisure, but that it's also a life of meaning. God, we ask that you would help us to consider your conviction towards us, that we would be convicted by these words of challenge. What have we seen you do and we haven't responded to it the way you would have us? What are you wanting us to do? What are you still wanting us to change in our lives and we haven't done it? God, spark us to some self-reflection, not just for the fun of it, but so that we can truly and meaningfully follow after you in our lives. God, we also pray that you would help us accept this invitation at the end of this chapter to come and lay down our heavy burdens, to put your yoke on, to pull with you, to work with you, to follow after you, to be a laborer in your kingdom, laborers that are working towards truth and grace and love and reconciliation and redemption, people who are giving ourselves to you. God, thank you for Jesus and for all that he does. We ask this in his name. Amen. Well, thank you for joining me. I'm Nick Robinson here on The Daily Path for February 3rd, 2025. We'll see you next time.